Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome back to Modern Leadership, where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to talk about their journey and leadership today. It's so good to be with you. Shall we dispense with introductions and just get right into it? Let me introduce today's guest expert, Craig Dowden Ph.D. He's a certified positive psychology coach. He's on a mission to share the science and practice of positive leadership. He's a longtime columnist at the Financial Post and the Huffington Post and has an upcoming column slated for Forbes. Craig combines years of interviewing and coaching top CEOs with extensive knowledge of business psychology in his brand new book, Do Good to Lead Well, The Science and Practice of Positive Leadership. Craig, it's so wonderful to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm doing great, Jake. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure being here.
You know, it's great to have you on the show, and I'm looking forward to jumping into this book and this idea of positive psychology and your background. But before we do, what did we miss by way of intro on the personal front? Who is Craig Dowden?
Well, I would say that I've been fascinated by what makes people tick for a very, very long time. This has, I guess, been a culmination of my journey. And I've always been curious about, so what makes people tick? And when I started on this pathway, I always found that people have personalities. And then for me, organizations have personalities. And I thought if I intersect those two subjects, I'm never going to be bored. So that pretty well, I feel so fortunate that in the work that I do, basically was able to combine both of my passions. So I just love the intersection between people and organization and business, because I just find there's so much fascinating stuff to talk about.
Well, take us back to how you made this decision to kind of go down this path in life. So you're yes, you've gone through school in the psychology field. Is this kind of what you had in mind as you went through that?
It's a great question. I was always, from the earliest growing up, I was always interested in people. And for me, what was so fascinating is that how you and I could be exposed to the same situation and see it entirely differently. And so I just thought that's so fascinating, and what leads us to see things in such a different light. And so it got me really, really curious. And then as I started down the path and got into my graduate studies, it just was so intriguing to me to be able to unpack that. And I think also on top of it was the scientific perspective. So as I started to get into the research, the social science, the leadership science, the organizational sciences, it was just so fascinating to add that empirical element to the conversation as well. So on top of my own fascination of the complexities of the human experience, hey, there's really interesting and cool data that comes out of this. So it just naturally flowed, and the more I got into the subject matter, the more I loved it, and I've been very fortunate to be able to continue on that path.
When you talk about it naturally flowed, and I can understand that as you're going through the educational process and working on your graduate work, but then you come out into the business world, and you look at the world and you say, I have this background, this study of people and kind of the processes that they go through. I think I can add this to businesses. I think I can marry the two. And I would imagine that at the time, and even today, there's some pushback a little bit. And this is what would be considered maybe the softer side of business. And so I want to ask you how you saw that as an opportunity and how it's been in presenting it to the world.
Well, I love that question. And you're absolutely right, because as I continued my studies and then became, introduced to the business world, it was fascinating that within every organization, regardless of size, sector, industry, regardless of what was happening, at the end of the day, the things that were being discussed and the largest challenges were more often than not people, and getting people on the same page, aligned, motivated. So that was fascinating to me. And to your point, which is spot on, is that then sometimes this can be seen as the softer side, the muddier side. It's more complicated. And so that was one of my primary motivations in pursuing my doctorate, was that I really wanted to have a firm understanding of the research so that when I went into an organization, I could engage in a conversation and say, this is not just the right thing to do. This is the right thing to do for your business. And here's why. Here's what is at stake if we don't follow these principles of positive leadership. Because again, sometimes there can be this assumption, incorrect assumption that, well, if you have a positive organization or if people are happy, then that can lead to slacking off and people not performing and things like that. And so once clients and organizations get exposed to and introduced to this very compelling database of research that have been conducted by independent organizations, authors, academics, now they can see, wow, look at what happens when we build our organizations around these core pillars. So that was this wonderful, and that was the primary reason, or one of the primary reasons I did want to pursue my graduate work, so that when I spoke to people, I could really do a deep dive into the research and then the application, which is something I love about your podcast in terms of, so how do we translate this into practice?
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think what you're talking about is so vitally important, and that is, while in the past, and maybe some people today would think of it as the softer side, the truth is the empirical data shows that these traits, getting people to work well, getting them to focus on the mission, getting teams to gel together, the synergy, all of these things have definite measurable outcomes. And it's not just about this soft side. It really has what we would call more of the traditional finance implications to it. Now, before we jump into this book, which is the direction we're going next, I want to ask you, so you working on your PhD, you graduate, you put on the robes, you put on the square hat, maybe you throw it up with the rest of the graduating class. Where do you go from there? Did you just break out on your own, or did you go work for somebody else?
Well, and one of the great things about the PhD is that I did a lot of practicums. So that was something that followed me as well as I was doing my doctoral work, was that I wanted to do practicums and get out and have the opportunity to apply what I was learning in graduate school in organizations. So because of that, I was able to have a lot of different engagements. Some of them were unpaid, some of them were paid, where started to apply these principles in practice. And so when I initially started off, I had been doing consulting work throughout my doctorate. So I had been doing contractual work with different organizations. And in fact, when I graduated, there was a terrific opportunity where I was able to be the managing director of a local business psychology firm. Just right out of their managing director had just left. The position was open, and I had already done a fair amount of contractual work, and they wanted to get me on board. So right away, I kind of jumped right in with both feet into this space, and then started to be able to, again, bring this evidence-based perspective to the consulting work that we were doing.
And I think there's a great lesson to be had here about following your passion, following your interest, going after the things that you believe in and working hard, and then opportunities open up. I'm a big believer in this universal choreography, that there's opportunity all around us, and that if we have our eyes open to it, the universe will swing that dance partner into our way, and then we'll be able to take it from there. And I think that's kind of what happened in your life, that you knew the direction you wanted to go, and then opportunities for you to do that showed up. Now, here we go. Fast forward to 2019. We got this brand new book, Do Good to Lead Well, The Science and Practice of Positive Leadership. And one of the things that you talk about is that many of us leaders feel like we're kind of between a rock and a hard place, in that there's this trade-off we feel between doing good and being a great leader. And maybe we've seen this in the media, maybe we've seen it in some of the biographies we've read, but this is something that you tackle head on. So talk to us a little bit about this trade-off and how this is a mischaracterization of what's really out there.
For me, what was really important in the discussions I've had with different senior executives, CEOs, business leaders, is that there was this almost existential crisis around, well, if I do good, if I'm positive, if I'm reinforcing, supportive, well, then I'm not going to be able to drive business results. And so it was almost like I have to sacrifice my values in order to drive performance on the bottom line. They were seen as dichotomous in orientation, and it's this or that. And I think what's really compelling about the data is that, well, in fact, these go together. It's kind of like peanut butter and jelly. They make a fabulous combination. And so what I really wanted to do was be able to shed some light on, you know what, when you look at this, especially from an evidence-based perspective, there's countless research studies that demonstrate that these two things, when we do good, we do lead well. And a very powerful quote, I had the great fortune of speaking with Doug Conant, the former CEO of Campbell's, and when he took over, they were, if not the lowest scoring company in the history of the Gallup Engagement Survey, they were one of the lowest. In a few short years, he was able to transform that. And he had a fabulous quote, which I love to share too. He says, I'm tough on standards and soft on my people. And so in his experience, once again, people felt I could be tough on standards or I can be soft. So again, they created this artificial dichotomy. And I love that I can demand results and I can drive results and I can still do it in a positive way. So that was something I wanted to really integrate and make it at the forefront of this book.
And let me ask you a little bit about consistency when you talk about this, because I'm a big believer that you can be tough on your people in that you can hold them accountable. You can require them to work hard for you. But also this idea of being soft on people, understanding that people are trying to do the best they can, that sometimes they do get flat tires or sometimes, they're having an off day, and having these two work together. But as a leader, let me ask you about consistency and approaching the situation in a consistent manner.
I think that's you're touching on such an essential component of leadership because, so as an example, and this comes out in my coaching and consulting work as well. So let's say there are corporate values on the wall about how we treat each other, how we have a team meeting, how we're supposed to treat each other in our organization. And yet there's a quote unquote superstar performer in the organization who's incredibly toxic and hostile and doesn't follow any of the values that we say are important. And then the leadership in the organization basically does not address the issue because this person is a rainmaker and bringing in such incredible results. And so right away, what ends up happening across the organization is that there's tremendous disconnect. People now just see these values as empty words on a wall. And as Adam Grant talked about in his bestseller, he was able to share research which shows that, well, when you get into those situations, that one apple can spoil the bunch. And in fact, when you remove that really challenging, toxic individual from the mix, even if nobody is able to produce at the level that this individual did, him or herself, what happens is collectively people outperform. So if we're on a team of 6, the collective output, once this person is gone, exceeds whatever large amount that they were able to contribute on an individual basis. So there's not only an important way of, again, maintaining consistency between values and lived behaviors, there's also importance around, well, when you act on that, there's tangible results from an organizational perspective.
And I think this is a great example of hindsight being 20/20. I mean, when you have a bad apple on your team, during the time that you're there, it's hard to see that. It's hard to recognize it. You make excuses, but then all of a sudden, as you get yourself away from that situation, maybe a couple of years in the future, you look back and you realize, hindsight being 20/20, I should have got rid of that person much sooner. You mentioned Adam Grant. Adam Grant, as an interesting aside, his book, Givers and Takers, was the book theme for 2018 for the Modern Leadership Podcast. It was the book that had the most impact on me throughout the whole year. And when we talk about the name Adam Grant, we talk about the name Marshall Goldsmith, we talk about the name Daniel Pink. These are all 3 incredible leaders who put their name and stamp of approval on this book of yours. Dan Pink actually said, this is ideal reading for people who want to make a positive impact. So tell me, how is it to work with these 3 great leadership experts?
Well, it's incredibly inspiring. And the foundation for how I approached the writing of this book very much was inspired by them. I love each of their approaches in terms of essentially, and Dan Pink, who I asked permission to kind of take his classic phrase, because for Drive, he said, what I want to do is bridge the gap between what science knows and what business does. And then I asked him, can I say I want to bridge the gap between what science knows and what leaders do? And he said, sure, go right ahead. And that really, and each of those three international thought leaders, that is their orientation. I have so much admiration for that, because there's so much value in the science and the scientific research. And then sometimes they can be abstract ideas and things that are just out there that sound interesting or compelling. And yet when it comes to the day-to-day, how do we translate that? And I love, again, how you took give and take and made that the core theme of 2018 for your podcast, because in that book, again, it's here are some concrete strategies that we can use to be able to honor those principles. So the idea is compelling, and now what is it that we can do to live that? And so each of those individuals inspired me to want to write the book, and I'm so thrilled that they felt that they were comfortable to add their name to it and endorse it in such a way, because for me, I've been huge fans of them for so long, and feel like their approach really adds so much value to the executives and organizations that they serve.
Well, this is ideal reading for those of us who want to make positive impacts. So let's open it up a little bit and talk about some of these topics that really resonated with me. The first one I want to ask you about is this apologizing leader. And so leaders aren't perfect, right? And although they stand sometimes in the front of an organization, and many of the people in that organization are looking to them for leadership and guidance and kind of their example, sometimes they make mistakes. And sometimes they need to turn to their people and say, I apologize. Tell me a little bit about this idea of the apologizing leader and how should we approach this?
And it's such a fascinating topic, and there's so much, again, research and applied experience. And so I'll ask you a question, Jake. So if let's say I do something or say something to you, and then I apologize for it. So I've harmed you or hurt you in some way, and then I apologize for it. And it's a sincere, timely apology. How do you feel about me?
Yeah, I really recognize that it took you standing up and recognizing the improvements that you're making and really coming to me in humility and that. Now, let me ask you, are you and I colleagues, or are we in a leadership follower position? Because the concern I have is I want to be a leader that people respect, and I don't want to appear weak.
Beautiful. And this is exactly, so what's really interesting is, and you're touching on this perfectly, is that a lot of times what we're concerned about, and when we're in a leadership role, is appearing weak by apologizing. And yet when I'll ask audiences, I'll say, okay, well, let's say your leader apologized to you and authentically take responsibility for his or her behavior. How do you feel about this person? And guess what everybody tells me?
Unanimous.
Exactly. I feel terrific. My level of respect for that person goes back to baseline, and in many cases is elevated. My level of trust returns the baseline, and in many cases is elevated. Yet, to your point, what's really interesting, when we ask ourselves, will we apologize? The first thing we think about is, people are going to think we're weak. So it's this fascinating dissonance between, we admire, respect, and trust people who apologize to us, yet when it comes time for us to apologize, we feel like we're going to look weak, so we don't do it. And I think that prevents a lot of us from stepping into that space around, they'll use it against me, or, I'm going to look incompetent. And so it sets up this fascinating dichotomy where we're very reluctant to use a technique which evidence has shown is a really powerful relationship rebuilder and, in fact, a relationship enhancer. Because as the leader of the team, if I apologize to you, what that shows is a couple of things. And I've worked with lots of executives, very senior executives, and crafted authentic apologies to their teams. And afterwards, what happens is that not only does their trust in this leader and executive go up, now what the team members think is that, in the future, if something goes wrong, Jake isn't going to throw me under the bus. Craig is going to take responsibility for that, and he's going to own up to it. So that's someone that I want to follow to the ends of the earth. That's someone I want to stay with because they're going to act with integrity, and now I'm going to give my all. And the fascinating byproduct is it tends to then lead to other people following suit, where they will raise their hand and say, you know what, Jake, I messed that up and I didn't follow up with the client in a timely manner, and so here's where I had the miss on that. Or they'll raise issues earlier in the game because they understand, you know what, making mistakes is all a part of the process, and what's important is we accept responsibility and learn from them. So it's such a powerful tool and often underutilized.
And as we do this, trust goes up within our organization. And when the team works together, when the team trusts each other, they can get more done. It's not 1 + 1 is 2. It's 1 + 1 is more than 2, especially when you have that trust factor. But I want to ask you, can we go too far? I mean, we've heard a lot lately in leadership circles where we talk about being authentic and we talk about being vulnerable. Can we go too far? Can that pendulum swing too far and we actually lose the respect of our teams by over disclosing or becoming weak by apologizing too much?
I would say the larger risk is when it's just seen as a checking off, putting a check in the tick box, where and we continue to do the behavior. I think that's where it gets really challenging is that if I'm doing a particular behavior and I'm so sorry, Jake, I was looking at my phone when we were meeting, and then 5 minutes later I'm back on my phone doing this, I'm so sorry. And so it seems like it's a throwaway. The potential for it being interpreted as weakness is, once again, if that people are apologizing for no reason. Like there isn't anything to be responsible for in terms of the behavior or what was said or done. So it's almost an advance, almost being preemptive in that space. And so when we apologize, what's key based on the science of apology is to say I'm sorry and then articulate, okay, this is what I am sorry for. And being sorry just to say I'm sorry, that doesn't have the same impact. What's important for the receiver of that apology is to understand what it is that we're apologizing for and why that's important. Because a couple of things, A, that helps to highlight that I know the behavior for which I'm apologizing, and B, it maximizes your trust in me that, you know what, in the future, since Craig knows what it is that he's apologizing for, it minimizes the risk that he'll make that same mistake again. So that is a critical part, and so I believe those are the conditions, kind of those caveats where we can't apologize too much.
That's great. I love that. And so one of the big themes of this book is, what causes good people to become bad leaders? And, being a leadership podcast where we talk to leaders across the nation and help people to rise to that level, this is, I think, something that's on our minds a lot. Like, I feel like I'm a good person. What causes me to be a bad leader? Or where is this disconnect between who I'm trying to be and who I'm portrayed to be?
Well, I think there's a couple of pieces, and you're touching again on a very critical issue that's emerging within organizations, and so I think a couple of things. Number one is that we can have a self-awareness gap. So the evidence suggests that around, and this was based on a study of about 500,000 people, that around 30% of us possess a reasonable level of self-awareness. And so one of the wonderful benefits of my work is that I get to interview executives, particularly around selection, selecting for a particular role. And when you ask an executive or leader, like, what's one of your strengths, pretty well everybody I've ever spoken to have said they're a people person. Yet when you go into the research in organizations, what's the number one reason that people leave organizations? It's because of people management issues. It's because of the
disconnect with the upper management.
Exactly. And so what's really interesting, to your point, I think we all, the majority of us believe that we're a good person and we're attempting to do good. The challenge is that we approach this in different ways. And in fact, we can use the same word and have a wildly different definition of what that looks like. So as an example, I've coached executives who would say that being respectful in delivering feedback means I never give you any negative feedback because it could be demoralizing, demotivating. It's not respectful. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I've coached executives who feel like they will rip into you and make sure you never forget what they're telling you and how they're telling it to you, because they'll drive that point home so fiercely that you'll almost never recover and have no choice but to not forget this. Yet if you ask both people, are they respectful, and you look at values on the wall in an organization, they would both agree with, yes, I'm a respectful leader. Yet operationally, behaviorally, we have wildly different definitions in terms of how they're showing up as a leader. So I think the lack of clarity around what positive leadership means in an organization is sorely lacking. We use a lot of the buzzwords, and yet how we define them is different. I think the other challenge is around the degree of pressure. So stress, pressure that's in our environment. And there's lots of fabulous research that shows that when we are time pressured, when we're feeling anxious, our empathy lessens. And so even people who are very highly empathetic, which the research shows is one of the most critical predictors of effective leadership, when they are stressed, they can act in a very low empathy manner, which then makes us much more insular, much more self-focused, and then we can do things. So again, I'm so wrapped up in my own deadline that I don't pay attention to how I assign you a task, and now I can come across as disrespectful, harsh, self-interested, even though, again, my natural state is to be more empathetic. So I think that combination of lack of self-awareness and a really pressure-filled environment, it's this kind of challenging concoction of things that make it tough to do good.
You know, and for me, I know that when I'm hungry or tired, that I'm shorter with those that I work with, or I'm not thinking clearly, or I'm more demanding. And so one of the things I pulled out from what you were talking about is to avoid the extremes. You know, we talked about a couple of examples of a leader, two different leaders approaching the same word or the same situation on two ends of the spectrum. And that's one of the evidences that we need to look for as leaders. If we're falling too far on one end of this extreme, then we know that we're not probably being self-aware enough of what's going on. And then the other thing that I pulled out is it's so vital to have a coach, a personal coach, an executive coach, somebody that will help hold a mirror up to you, somebody that's not afraid to tell you, this is an area of weakness, this is an area of improvement for you to focus on. And so, Craig, I know we're running just short on time, but there's been one question I've been dying to ask you about all this research that you've been doing. You sat down with over 50 top CEOs. I mean, these are the top of the top. You asked them all your questions, and at the end of the day, I want to ask you, what's the one piece of advice or the best advice that you pulled out of your experience?
Wow,
It's unfair, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a fabulous. Well, there are so many. I may choose two. Number one, just to link with what we talked about, Jim Whitehurst, who's the CEO of Red Hat and a multi-billion-dollar open source software organization, and he wrote the Open Organization from Harvard Business Press. When I was speaking with him, this quote is so powerful. He said, people have an amazing capacity to forgive if we give them the opportunity. And I think that is profound and so ties in so nicely with what we were just discussing. And I think the other piece that I would add to it is that every leader, so maybe a macro statement, is that every leader talked to me about the importance of self-awareness and leaving our egos at the door. Every single one talked about and shared examples of where when they thought what was best in a situation and they closed off their ears and their interest in listening, created so many challenges, be that from a product launch, be it from motivating their teams, be it from building strong relationships with key stakeholders, be it getting seed funding for their startup. Every single one talked about how when they shut off and felt they had the right answer, beyond everyone else, it created tremendous difficulties. So I think for each of us, having that curiosity and humility is essential to being at our best and getting access to the information that you talked about earlier, Jake, we need to reach our maximum potential.
Yeah, the day of the egocentric CEO is gone. The world's moving too fast. There's too much information. We can no longer be generalists. We have to be specialists, which means we need to be humble and open to the support and help of other people around us. Otherwise, our company will stall at our potential and will never reach greatness because it will only be what we can do on our own, not with the team. Craig, before we let you go today, let's shift gears just a little bit. I got 4 more questions for you, and they all come from the Learning from Leaders section, which is a little bit of personal to go along with this business conversation. Sound like a plan?
Sounds great.
All right, we want to know the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table. What are you reading?
There's a great Amy Edmondson's new book on psychological safety just came out early this year. And given the current climate and so much around how do you foster an environment where people feel comfortable speaking up, I'm just getting into that and very excited to read it.
Very cool. How about your leadership superpower?
I was really intrigued by your assessment and loved it. And so mine is inspiration.
Oh, very cool. And that will be 2 guest experts in a row that were inspiration with their superpower. And of course, Craig, you're referring to the free leadership superpower assessment that can be found on jakeacarlson.com/superpower. And that's awesome. I mean, I can see just from the way that you're talking, how do you sit down with 50 CEOs from a positive psychological standpoint and not be inspiring? So I could totally see that.
Yeah, it was. When I got it, it definitely resonated with me. So
Very cool. Very cool. All right. How about a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra, something that you live by?
I would say, to me, the answer is always no if I don't ask the question. That's something that's been really powerful for me to remember, because so many times we don't ask people a question because of our own discomfort or things like that. And I think I remind myself, if I don't ask you a question, the answer is automatically no. So I'd rather ask the question.
Craig, I've got a smile from ear to ear, and I got to take you on a little aside story here. So I like to go to the local gas station and pick up a soda. And yes, I know it's not healthy for me, and I know all of that, but I like to do it. It's my vice, and I like it. And sometimes I'll take my kids with me, and I'll go in there and I'll just quietly go and get my soda and fill it up. And I can see them looking at it and wanting one for themselves. And the answer is always no until they ask. And I'm really trying to help them to understand that if they want something, they need to be assertive. They need to ask for it. And if they don't, we go get in the car. And I know some people are rolling their eyes. Jake's a bad dad. But I'm trying to help them understand that the answer is always no until you ask. And when you ask, by the way, 100% of the time, I'll tell you right now, it's yes from Dad for getting a soda.
Well, and I'm so thrilled at that story, and it's a perfect story because it is. And I think it's so powerful for us to remember that very principle. And I think, again, and it's something I work on too, is that, okay, if I'm uncomfortable asking the question, how can I ask it so I feel authentic? Back to a theme you talked about earlier. So that's fantastic.
What a great quote. Okay, our final question then is the book that you most often gift to friends, family, or colleagues.
Well, I would say, so people may be familiar with the Getting to Yes book by William. So I gift The Power of a Positive No. That is the 3rd book in the series. So it was Getting to Yes was the first one. Getting Past No was the second. And few people that I've come across are familiar with the 3rd, which is The Power of a Positive No. And I love the book because of the simplicity of the model. And so many of us have challenges in how to say no. We either avoid a conversation, or we will say we'll see, or do something that almost sets the expectation we'll do it and then just kind of drift off. And so the model and people that I've shared this book with love it because it empowers us to say a no in a way that honors our values, honors the other person's values, and then explores a mutual solution. So I've shared that book with many, many people.
And I struggle with this, Craig. I need to pick up a copy. I chuckled when you said Getting to Yes. That was a textbook, actually, that they gave us in law school. I mean, I know it's a small paperback book, but it was one of the textbooks in law school in my negotiations class. But I know that I need to take a look on the other side, and that is saying no to more things, because every time you say yes to something else, you're saying no to maybe something more important. So awesome. Sure appreciated going down that walk of learning from leaders with you. Before we let you go, how can we find out more about you and any last bit of advice for our listeners?
You can check me out at craigdowden.com, and I have a newsletter on the science and practice of positive leadership where I share interviews with some of the authors I mentioned. I share content there. It's free. I have a positive leadership assessment that you can take on my website as well, and people can download a free copy of a free chapter in my book if you go to the website as well. So, and would love to have that conversation and connect on LinkedIn. My goal is to build a community of people, accomplished executives and business leaders like yourself, who are passionate about the science and practice of positive leadership.
Well, that's awesome. And we're going to link it all up on the show notes for this episode so we can send everybody directly there. And I think it's great what you're doing. Thank you for coming on the Modern Leadership Podcast this week and being our guest expert.
You're most welcome, Jake. It was an absolute pleasure. Loved the questions and the conversations, and looking forward to continuing the discussion.
All right, here's take number 3 on this outro. I keep having to shut down and restart because we've got some jets flying around right outside the house, and they seem to feel that now is a good time to do some flybys, Top Gun style. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed that episode. Craig is such a fascinating guest and such a great guy. You know, we spent 10 minutes before we hit record, another 10 minutes after we hit record. And it's just exciting to talk to someone who has such a passion about blending this idea of science and psychology with business and motivation. Of course, everything that we talked about can be found on the show notes for this episode at jakeacarlson.com/ML114 for episode 114. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.